In this lecture, we try to relate our skin and the nervous system. Before you embark on this lecture, I hope it will be useful to go through the integumentary system lecture. So at the end of this lecture, we hope we have better understanding of different types of sensory receptors in the skin and the components of a reflex arc. I hope we will also see sensory reflex, and we also talk about dermatomes. To start with, I want to remind you about the characteristics of skin. Skin is waterproof, it is washable, it has ability to repair spontaneously, it is stretchable, it will remain with us and protect our body for the rest of our lives. It contributes 7% of our body weight, and it is the largest organ in our body. The skin has two layers, the superficial epidermis layer, which is made of stratified squamous epithelium, and deeper dermis layer, which is made of connective tissue. The layer underneath the dermis, which is called hypodermis, it is not included in the skin. These are the functions of the skin, which include protection, sensation, temperature regulation, vitamin D protection, and excretion. But of course, in this lecture, we will discuss about sensation via the sensory receptors for touch, temperature, pain, and pressure. This is the photomicrograph of the skin, which is showing epidermis and dermis. In the dermis, there are two layers, papillary dermis and reticular dermis. I hope you remember derma papillae, which are trying to invade into the epidermal region. And epidermis has 5 layers, which start with stratum basale. When we talk about receptors in our body, we are talking, according to the location, we can classify into exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, and proprioceptors. Exteroreceptors mean these receptors which are exposed to the external environment. For example, receptors in the skin. Interoreceptors are for the internal viscera, internal organs. And proprioceptors are present in the muscles, tendons, and joints. So we have a different lecture about proprioceptors, muscle, tendon, joints, and their relationship to the nervous system. But in this lecture, we just concentrate on the skin receptors. So this is the diagram of the skin. And here we can see again, like epidermis and dermis. In the dermis, we see nervous structures, like free nerve endings, and this type of receptors. We get into detail later. So now when there is a stimulus on the skin, for example, pinprick, this stimulus will be picked up by the sensory receptors in the skin, and these receptors will discharge action potential, which will be carried by the sensory neuron, which is carrying the information, action potential from the skin receptor to the spinal cord, which enters into the posterior column. And it will relay the information to the interneuron. And as you can see here, there is a gap in between the end of the sensory neuron and the interneuron. This gap is called synapse, SYNAPSE synapse. And from the interneural, it will go to the anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And the information will be relayed to the motor neuron. And then that motor neuron will go to the effector organ, which is the muscle, which will cause the contraction of the muscle. So now we have seen receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, interneuron, motor neuron, and the effector organ. So these are the 5 basic components of all reflex arc. And now we will concentrate on the receptors in the skin. So this is the cross section of the skin, which is showing different skin receptors at different depth of the skin. So if you look at that here, just at the dermoepidermal junction, we can see Merkel disc or Merkel cell receptors. In the dermal papilla here, we can see Meissner's corpuscle. And these free nerve endings, they are all widespread in the dermis. And the Pacinian corpuscle, they are lying deep down in the dermis. And therefore, if we want to stimulate this Pacinian corpuscle, we need to put certain pressure on the skin to stimulate it. And therefore, these Pacinian corpuscles will be responsible for the pressure or vibration sensation. Those receptors which are present close to the superficial layer of the skin, they will be stimulated by just with light touch or just touch. So these are the diagrams of the Merkel's, so Meissner's corpuscle and Pacinian corpuscle. So as we know, Merkel cells, they are present in the dermoepidermal junction, and their function is to pick up the tactile stimuli or very light touch. They might also play a role in the neurodevelopment. Meissner's corpuscle, they are present in the dermal papilla as we saw on our previous diagrams. They are rapidly adapting, and their function is to detect the touch. Of course, it might be not as light as the Merkel cell, but it is still some form of light touch. So this 100 times light micrograph is showing the Meissner cell in the dermal papilla. And again, like this Meissner cell in the dermal papilla, and now we come to the lamella or Pacinian corpuscle. These are larger, these are fewer, and these lie deep in the base of the dermis. Their shape is oval, their size is about 1 millimeter in length, which means it is pretty large for a skin receptor. They are responsible is to pick up the pressure or vibration stimuli. And now, this is the diagram showing the Pacinian corpuscle. As you can see, there is the N-myelinated nerve fiber, which is surrounded by multiple layers of lamella. And once they leave the lamellae, they are covered with the myelin sheath. Free nerve endings, as I say, they are widespread present in the dermis. These free nerve endings, we pick up the temperature changes. For the cold temperature, they will have cold thermoreceptors. And for the heat and hot temperature, there we have hot thermoreceptors. And we also have receptors called nociceptors. These are the receptors which we pick up the stimuli which can endanger the skin cells. And there will be itch receptors. All of these are present as free nerve endings in the dermis. So now, when our tip of our finger is go and touch, let's say, for example, something sharp and pointed object, the skin receptors at the tip of the finger will take the action potential stimulated by that stimuli and will be taken via the sensory or afferent neuron, and it will go to the dorsal root ganglia and then enter into the posterior root of the spinal cord. Then in the integration center, we have interneuron, and that interneuron will come and act on the anterior motor neuron, which leave from the anterior horn cell and along the ventral root, and that will go and act on the effector organ, which is the muscle. And that will cause the contraction of the muscle, which will produce flexion of the elbow, which will remove the finger from the nauseous stimuli. Of course, this contains sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron, and therefore it is called polysynaptic, and it is a reflex. Reflex means it happens at subconscious level, which is reproducible, reliable response. And there is no conscious act on this. So this means, when we touch something unpleasant, it will our fingers and hand will just withdraw at subconscious level. We don't even need to think about that. And now if we look at this more complex diagram, we have a stimulus, which is a pinprick on the shoulder. And this pinprick will be picked up by the sensory receptors, and sensory receptors from the sensory receptors, the sensory neuron will carry the information into the dorsal root of the spinal cord via the interneuron. It will innervate on the motor neuron, and it will act on the muscle. But at the same time, and this is a parallel event, some of the nerve impulse will be crossing to the opposite side and going up to the sensory cortex. Now, let's talk about dermatomes. Dermatomes are the particular area of the skin which is innervated by the cutaneous branch of a single particular spinal nerve. So as we know, spinal nerve leave the spinal cord at different level of the spine. And if we look at in this diagram, the cervical 5 spinal nerve will be carrying the sensation from the anterior aspect of the elbow and the shoulder tip. Like some significant points are nipple line, which is carried by the thoracic fold, spinal nerves, and sensation in the groin, which is carried by the lumbar 1 spinal nerve. In front of the knee and medial malleolus, skin sensation will be carried by the lumbar 4 spinal nerve, and so on. Of course, all the sensory information will also be carried by the named nerve, for example, like axillary nerve, radial nerve, femoral nerve, obturator nerves. I'm going to stop here. We have a lab session for these sensations, and I hope you will understand better once we completed our lab. Thank you.